civilian infrastructure. I must remind all parties of the obligation to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects as international humanitarian law demands. Mr. President, the escalation in military activity and the shifting front lines are making humanitarian operations extremely dangerous and exposing aid workers to serious harm. Nevertheless, humanitarian organizations continue to assist hundreds of thousands of people in need. In the first 7 months of 2024, some 6.2 million people received humanitarian assistance in Ukraine. Humanitarians are providing support to thousands of people in frontline communities, emergency relief and relocation support to those evacuating, and improving living conditions for internally displaced people in collective sites. And ahead of winter, our winter response plan and preparedness efforts are proceeding at full speed. Here, I want to pay tribute to the courage of all humanitarian workers in Ukraine, particularly the local volunteers, civil society organizations, and other groups who risk their lives to provide this support and who keep humanity alive amid the death and destruction. Mr. President, we remain deeply concerned about the 1.5 million people who we have been unable to reach at any adequate scale in regions of Ukraine occupied by the Russian Federation, in parts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhia. Like all others living in frontline areas of Ukraine, they undoubtedly require urgent health care, medicine, food, and clean drinking water. As winter approaches, these needs will become more acute. We renew our call for the safe, rapid, and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief to all civilians in need in accordance with international humanitarian law. Mr. President, we are grateful to the donors who so far this year have provided almost $1.4 billion for the humanitarian response in Ukraine. However, 3/4 of the way through the year, the humanitarian needs and response plan is still less than half funded. To sustain operations in an increasingly complex and dangerous environment, we urgently need donors to increase and accelerate flexible funding for the response. This is even more pressing as another winter approaches. This war has gone on far too long. It has caused immense suffering and left more than 14.6 million people, or 40% of Ukraine's population, in need of humanitarian assistance. As it escalates, its toll will only increase. Protecting civilians and ultimately ending this war is a matter of will. As heads of state and government leaders prepare to attend the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, opening today, I once again call on Council members, indeed all member states, to seize every opportunity to secure the decisions that will spare civilians and finally bring this war to an end. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Msuya for her briefing. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie Madame Msuya pour son exposé. Ce Conseil s'est réuni à plus de 20 reprises sur la situation humanitaire en Ukraine depuis l'agression illégale de la Russie le 24 février 2022. C'est la 7e fois cette année. La Russie doit enfin respecter le droit international et les principes humanitaires de distinction et de proportionnalité. Elle doit cesser ses frappes contre les civils et les infrastructures civiles. En dépit de cela, elle continue de cibler méthodiquement des objectifs civils. Chaque jour, elle frappe écoles, hôpitaux, crèches, jardins d'enfants, centres commerciaux, transports en commun, bâtiments résidentiels. Personne n'oublie les massacres de la gare de Kramatorsk, de l'immeuble de Vinnytsia, de l'imprimerie de Kharkiv, de l'hôpital pour enfants Okhmaditz à Kiev, du centre commercial de Kostiantynivka. La Russie s'efforce de saper le moral du peuple ukrainien. Des salves massives ont visé l'ensemble du territoire ukrainien les 26 et 27 août, puis de nouveau en septembre, visant des infrastructures énergétiques. Plus de la moitié des capacités de production énergétique sont aujourd'hui détruites ou endommagées, exposant les civils à un 3e hiver dans le froid. La France condamne l'exportation par l'Iran et l'acquisition par la Russie de missiles balistiques. Il s'agit d'une nouvelle escalade du soutien militaire de l'Iran et d'une violation flagrante de la résolution 2231. Des missiles iraniens atteindront le sol européen et accentueront les souffrances du peuple ukrainien. Monsieur le Président, les frappes russes en profondeur, loin des lignes de front, ne visent pas des objectifs militaires directs, mais des infrastructures civiles. Elles peuvent être constitutives de crimes contre l'humanité. C'est à ce titre que la Cour pénale internationale a émis le 5 mars 2024 2 mandats d'arrêt contre Sergueï Ivanovitch Kobilak, lieutenant général de l'armée de l'air russe, et Viktor Nikolaïevitch Sokolov, vice-amiral et commandant de la flotte russe de la mer Noire. Le sort des 1,5 million d'Ukrainiens dans les territoires occupés est tragique. La Russie doit permettre l'accès des organisations humanitaires à cette population. Depuis le premier jour, la France soutient l'Ukraine et les pays voisins face aux conséquences humanitaires du conflit. Elle a mobilisé près de 400 millions d'euros afin de répondre aux besoins d'urgence et réhabiliter les infrastructures essentielles. La Russie est coupable de multiples violations des droits de l'homme dans les territoires occupés et de violations du droit international humanitaire à l'encontre des prisonniers de guerre ukrainiens. Elle est une nouvelle fois dénoncée dans le dernier rapport annuel du secrétaire général sur les enfants et les conflits armés. Elle se rend responsable de meurtres, de mutilations et d'attaques contre les écoles et les hôpitaux. Le président Poutine fait l'objet d'un mandat d'arrêt de la Cour pénale internationale pour des crimes présumés de déportation et de transfert illégal d'enfants. Je rappelle que tous les États partis au statut de Rome ont l'obligation d'exécuter ce mandat d'arrêt. Monsieur le Président, voilà plus de 900 jours que nous dénonçons l'ampleur et la gravité des crimes commis par la Russie en Ukraine. Elle devra en rendre compte. Il est plus que temps qu'elle cesse de trahir les obligations qui sont les siennes et mette fin à sa guerre d'agression. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for the statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias. Señor Presidente, agradezco a la Secretaria General Adjunta, Joyce Msuya, por su informe. Desde la última vez que este Consejo se reunió para recibir un informe sobre la situación humanitaria en Ucrania, hemos sido testigos de preocupantes desarrollos sobre el terreno, que han exacerbado las tensiones y que continúan afectando severamente a la población civil. Ha sido particularmente preocupante constatar los informes detallados por la señora Msuya el día de hoy en relación al número de víctimas civiles en Ucrania, así como el daño a infraestructura crítica a causa de recientes ataques con misiles y drones. De igual manera, preocupa el impacto negativo sobre la población civil, con decenas de muertos y heridos, y la evacuación de cientos de miles de personas a causa de la expansión del área geográfica del conflicto, tanto en Ucrania como en Rusia. Los ataques contra civiles e infraestructuras civiles son inaceptables, independientemente de dónde se produzcan. El Ecuador reitera que es imperativo que se proteja la vida de los civiles y se resguarden las infraestructuras civiles conforme a los principios y mandatos del derecho internacional humanitario, especialmente aquellos que exigen que las partes en conflicto actúen con distinción proporcionalidad y precaución. De igual manera, las partes deben actuar con la máxima responsabilidad y evitar cualquier acción que pueda poner en riesgo la seguridad de las plantas nucleares en Ucrania y Rusia para evitar un desastre humanitario y ambiental inconmensurable. Por otra parte, reconozco una vez más los esfuerzos de las Naciones Unidas y sus socios humanitarios, quienes continúan proporcionando asistencia vital a los afectados, a pesar de los riesgos a los que se exponen. Las partes deben proteger a los trabajadores humanitarios y garantizar el acceso sin trabas de la ayuda humanitaria a las zonas más afectadas en cumplimiento de la Resolución 2730 de este Consejo. Señor Presidente, como bien lo señaló el subsecretario Miroslav Jencha en esta sala hace pocos días, tras una década de conflicto en el este de Ucrania y de la ocupación de la República Autónoma de Crimea y de la ciudad de Sebastopol, y después de 2 años y medio de iniciada la agresión, el sufrimiento de la población ucraniana no cesa. Por ello, no debemos permitir que la guerra se normalice. A pesar de que los informes sobre los horrores del conflicto se vuelven cada vez más frecuentes, no podemos perder de vista que detrás de cada cifra hay vidas humanas truncadas, familias destrozadas y comunidades enteras desarraigadas. El Ecuador hace su parte e insta a este Consejo a trabajar a favor de la desescalada y el cese de las hostilidades. Reitera su llamado a que termine la violencia, se garantice la protección de los civiles y se retome el diálogo y la diplomacia para recuperar la paz en el marco del respeto de la integridad territorial e independencia política de Ucrania y en consonancia con la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, el derecho internacional y las resoluciones de la Asamblea General. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我要感谢姆苏亚代理副秘书长的通报。乌克兰的战火仍在延宕，人道局势日益严峻，外溢风险持续显现。长期冲突已经给双方平民带来巨大苦难，造成严峻的人道危机。战争延续只会产生更多伤害破坏，加剧国际和地区局势动荡。早日停火止战，寻求政治解决，符合各方利益。当务之急是遵守战场不外溢、战事不升级、各方不拱火3原则，尽快推动局势降温。中方再次呼吁冲突当事方保持冷静克制，切实遵守国际法，特别是国际人道法，避免袭击平民和民用设施，避免攻击核电站等和平核设施。我们呼吁冲突当事方展现政治意愿，相向而行，早日开启和谈。呼吁国际社会秉持客观公正立场，为双方恢复直接对话谈判创造条件，提供帮助。主席，中方在乌克兰问题上的立场十分明确，一以贯之，那就是劝和促谈，政治解决。我们始终主张各国主权、领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守，各国合理安全关切都应该得到重视，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应该得到支持。越是形势复杂，越不能放弃和平希望。国际社会应秉持客观公正立场，发出积极和建设性的声音，呼吁早日停火止战，重启和谈。中国和巴西共同发表了关于推动政治解决乌克兰危机的6点共识，符合大多数国家的共同期望。其他一些发展中国家也在为和平奔走，为促谈努力，提出不少好的主张和建议。中方愿继续同全球南方及有关国家保持密切接触沟通， 为推动政治解决危机发挥建设性的作用。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Undersecretary General, Madam Joyce Msuya, for her insightful briefing. At the outset, I would like to reiterate Algeria's deep concern over the continued deterioration of the humanitarian situation caused by the conflict in Ukraine. Despite the numerous calls of the international community to de-escalate tensions and to favor dialogue and diplomacy, this conflict is still fueled by confrontation and military action. As a result, we deplore the continued loss of lives among civilians on both sides of the border. The number of refugees and internally displaced persons keeps growing as civilians continue to flee from conflict areas, trying to find safe shelter for their families. In the meantime, critical civilian infrastructure is still being targeted by military operations. The approaching winter will further complicate the humanitarian situation and prolongs the suffering of millions of people, including women, children, and the elderly. Against this backdrop, Algeria emphasizes the need to respect and uphold the rules of international law, including international humanitarian law. Algeria reiterates its call to the parties to end all hostilities, reverse the trend of bloodshed and destruction, and favor diplomacy and peaceful settlement of disputes. It is critical for both parties, as well as for the international community, to join efforts to lay the ground for inclusive and constructive dialogue and negotiations. Neither confrontation nor polarization did or will take this conflict closer to any peaceful solution. Only a genuine dialogue between the parties could lead to a peaceful political solution based on the principles and purposes of the UN Charter and the legitimate security concerns of all parties. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Algeria for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I'd like to thank Acting USG Msuya for her briefing today. Colleagues, over 2.5 years since Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, it is the Ukrainian people who continue to bear the terrible consequences of Russia's aggression. 14 million Ukrainians are already in need of humanitarian assistance. Rather than end this suffering, Russia has chosen to sharply increase its attacks on schools and hospitals in recent months. This Council met in July to discuss the particularly shocking damage caused by a Russian missile strike on the Okhmedit Children's Hospital. Since then, the situation has only got worse. The UN reports that Russian attacks have led to 184 civilian casualties in the last month in cities and towns across the country. And Russia continues to target key energy facilities across the country. Over 100 attacks since March have caused extended power cuts affecting millions of people. To be clear, direct attacks on civilian infrastructure constitute a war crime. This must end. This constant bombardment and Russia's aggression along the front line and in Ukrainian territory is also complicating the humanitarian response. As reported by OCHA on World Humanitarian Day, Ukraine is now one of the most dangerous contexts in the world for aid workers. There were over 225 incidents that directly impacted humanitarian operations last year, averaging 4 a week. The systemic denial of humanitarian access also means we cannot verify the full scale of violations and abuses being committed against Ukrainian civilians. The UK calls on Russia to comply with all its obligations under international humanitarian law, to take all feasible precautions to protect civilians, and to cease targeting infrastructure that provides the essential needs for Ukraine's population. Until Russia ends its aggression, Ukraine has the right to defend itself under Article 51 of the UN Charter. And in defending itself, Ukraine is defending us all. Ukrainians are risking their lives day in, day out to stand up for the values at the heart of this very institution, the UN, and the right of all our countries to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Mr. President, the UK remains steadfast in its support for Ukraine. We've committed £12.7 billion of support so far, including vital lethal aid, crucial humanitarian assistance, and funding for energy supplies. We will continue to support Ukraine in the face of this appalling aggression. And we reiterate, once again, our call for Russia to end this brutal war, to withdraw from Ukrainian territory, and to uphold its commitments under the UN Charter. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Acting Undersecretary General Masuya, for your briefing. And thank you to Ecuador and France for calling the Security Council's attention to the humanitarian impact of Russia's recent missile and drone assault on Ukraine. Colleagues, Russia's ongoing aerial assault on Ukraine, which began on August 24, Ukraine's Independence Day, and is the largest since Russia launched its invasion, has killed and injured hundreds of civilians and significantly degraded civilian life. It has exacerbated the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. Just 2 missile strikes against a military educational institute and a hospital in Poltava killed at least 51 people and injured hundreds more. With that, Russia has now destroyed 215 medical facilities and damaged another 1,646. Remember July, when Russian airstrikes destroyed the Okhmadit Children's Hospital. December 2023, when they damaged a maternity hospital in Dnipro. And in March 2022, when they struck a maternity and children's hospital in Mariupol. The list continues to grow. Russia also continues to attack the electricity grid, power generation, and natural gas infrastructure, leaving Ukraine with a power deficit this coming winter that will leave its citizens in the dark and cold. The damage to infrastructure is also severely restricting access to basic services like clean water. As this humanitarian crisis grows, we ask fellow member states to help defend the UN Charter by holding Russia accountable, by not pushing a peace process that lacks the support of Ukraine or rewards Russia for violating the Charter, and by denying Russia the material support it needs to wage war. We ask member states to provide Ukraine with the means to defend its people and repair its infrastructure. The United States has provided more than $2.6 billion in humanitarian assistance, including support for food, health, shelter, livelihood, protection, and water, sanitation, and hygiene assistance. We encourage other donors to support the humanitarian response through the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund or other partners. Humanitarian needs are just as critical now as at the start of the full-scale invasion. We remain equally committed to Ukraine's energy security. During the June 11-12 Ukraine Recovery Conference, G7 Plus partners collectively announced over $1 billion in new energy assistance. We are restoring as much power generation as possible and deploying emergency backup power solutions so Ukraine's people stay warm this winter. We will convene with our Italian partners a G7 Plus Ukraine Energy Ministerial later this month to further coordinate and energize those efforts. Colleagues, for some time, the U.S. has warned Iran publicly and privately, that transferring ballistic missiles to Russia would constitute a dramatic escalation. Russia has now received these missiles and will likely use them within weeks in Ukraine. As a consequence, the United States will announce sanctions later today against Iran. We will also consult with our partners on what additional steps may be needed to respond to this dangerous escalation. To Iran and the DPRK, our message is simple. The world is watching. Your transfer of weapons, especially missiles and drone technology, to Russia is enabling it to carry out its aggression in Ukraine, to kill civilians, and to broadly degrade civilian life. It makes you complicit, and it puts you on the wrong side of history. And as I said before, China cannot have it both ways. China cannot be for peace and the protection of the UN Charter while it enables Russia's war through dual-use imports or by backing a peace process that rewards Russia for invading another member state. We invite China to partner with us in holding Russia accountable for its atrocities in Ukraine and for launching this unjustified, brutal, and unnecessary war. Justice for victims of Russia's aggression is a prerequisite for lasting peace. To uphold the principles of the UN Charter, we must press Russia to end its unprovoked and needless war of conquest and the humanitarian crisis it has caused. Russia must immediately cease its aggression and fully withdraw from all territory within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank Acting USG Msuya for the timely and informative briefing. I also welcome the participation of representatives of Ukraine, Lithuania, EU, Sweden, and Poland at today's meeting. Once again, we return to this august chamber to address Russia's illegal and unjustifiable war against Ukraine and its people. However, today's meeting takes on a new sense of urgency, considering the escalatory large-scale attacks over the last 2 weeks. Such attacks have targeted civilian infrastructure throughout Ukraine, caused hundreds of civilian casualties, jeopardized nuclear safety and security, and once again laid bare the true face of Russian aggression. Under this alarming backdrop, allow me to focus on the following points. First, the Republic of Korea condemns in the strongest terms the large-scale and lethal Russian missile and drone attacks targeting multiple Ukrainian cities, including residential buildings, hospitals, schools, malls, hotels, religious institutions, and even an orphanage. This includes the disgraceful September 3rd attack on a hospital in Poltava and the September 4th attack on Lvov, which is Ukraine's westernmost city, far from the front line and long regarded as a safe space for civilians and aid workers. This underscores that nowhere in Ukraine is safe. I take this opportunity to extend our deepest condolences to the victims. Second, let me reiterate that Russia's ongoing wanton and indiscriminate attacks against civilians and civilian objects across Ukraine, including energy infrastructure, constitute flagrant violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. My delegation is gravely dismayed by recent media reports that present evidence of a summary execution of Ukraine POWs by Russian forces. The international community should demonstrate its resolute stance that those responsible for such heinous acts must be held fully accountable. We are also concerned by the ominous humanitarian threat of prolonged winter blackouts as the days get increasingly shorter and the temperatures continue to fall. Third, Russia's arms transactions with DPRK are not only illegal, contravening multiple Security Council resolutions, they are also deadly. The DPRK has now sent more than 13,000 containers carrying munitions to Russia. since September of last year. At the same time, at least dozens of North Korean ballistic missiles have been fired thus far. The number and the targeted areas of Russia's attacks using North Korean ballistic missiles are increasing in both frequency and intensity. There are as many as 10 UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions on the DPRK under Chapter 7 of the Charter since its first nuclear test in 2006, all of which were unanimously adopted in this chamber. However, it is unsettling that the sanctions regime is being seriously eroded as Russia is flagrantly violating these resolutions in its illegal war of aggression in Ukraine. We urge Russia to cease its illegal military cooperation with DPRK and fulfill its duty as a permanent member of the Security Council by ending this war. In closing, Mr. President, the Republic of Korea will continue to stand with the people of Ukraine and provide vital assistance in the areas of security, humanitarian aid, and reconstruction until they achieve just and lasting peace in their land. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Acting USG Masuya for her briefing. Since the last time this Council convened to discuss the situation in Ukraine, the situation on the ground has continued to deteriorate. Over the past days, we have witnessed an intensification of Russian missile and drone attacks in several Ukrainian cities. These include a large-scale drone attack on Kiev that left 50 killed and more than 300 injured. These attacks have continued to add to the death and suffering that the Ukrainian population has been forced to endure since the Russian Federation launched its aggression on Ukraine 2.5 years ago, in complete violation of the UN Charter. Malta once again condemns such attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure. We reiterate our unwavering position that civilians must be protected and that international humanitarian law must be respected by all parties at all times. Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in the country continues to deteriorate. This is deeply worrying. Malta extends its deep appreciation to OSHA and all humanitarian actors currently working on the ground. We call on the Russian Federation to facilitate the distribution of aid and access to all humanitarian workers in accordance with international humanitarian law. As is always the case, children are also paying an extremely heavy price. Too many Ukrainian children have been killed. Those who have survived are left to suffer the brunt of war. They are left to deal with the loss of parents and family members, permanent injuries, displacement, long-term trauma, and exploitation. Others have been deported or forcibly transferred, actions that may constitute a war crime or a crime against humanity. President, we will continue to support Ukraine and its right to defend itself in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter, as long as this unjustified war of aggression continues. To this end, we reiterate our full support to the mandate of the International Criminal Court, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, as well as to the register of damages caused by the aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine. We once again call on the Russian Federation to stop its attacks on Ukraine and halt its war of aggression. We reaffirm our unwavering support for Ukraine's independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. The UN Charter is clear on this matter. It is our collective duty to safeguard it. We must redouble our efforts towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Господин председатель, прежде чем я начну свое выступление, хотел бы вновь выразить несогласие с вашим решением допустить 3 страны-члены ЕС к участию в сегодняшнем заседании по правилу 37. Мы уже неоднократно отмечали, что выступление Евросоюза с общей позицией стран-членов по этому вопросу на заседаниях по Украине было бы вполне достаточно. Это тем более разочаровывает, что вы сами, господин председатель, в начале вашей вахты взяли на себя обязательство оптимизировать вопрос участия в заседаниях Совета по правилу 37. Видим в этом пример двойных стандартов и непоследовательности. Господин председатель, мы только что выслушали очередную порцию стенаний наших лицемерных западных коллег по поводу нанесенных российскими военными за последние дни ударов по имеющим отношение к военному потенциалу киевского режима и инфраструктурным объектам. Они действительно оказались весьма внушительными и эффективными. Среди пораженных объектов военное училище в Полтаве, готовившее специалистов по РЛС и РЭБ, гостиница в Кривом Роге, в которой проживали офицеры украинской разведки. Уничтожены также многочисленные важные объекты энергетики и аэродромной инфраструктуры Украины, склады горючего, арсеналы западных авиационных средств поражения и артиллерийских боеприпасов, цеха производства беспилотных летательных аппаратов, места хранения безэкипажных катеров, пункты временной дислокации подразделений националистических формирований и иностранных наемников. Отличительной особенностью данной серии ударов стала ликвидация значительного количества иностранных инструкторов, специалистов и наемников. Поэтому те, кто следит за этой темой, может ожидать большое количество некрологов о внезапной кончине высокопоставленных американских, британских, французских, польских и шведских военных. Мы изначально предупреждали, что те, кто приезжает помогать клике Зеленского удерживать на плаву ее военный потенциал или воюет в ее рядах, становятся нашей законной целью. И то, что гибнет все больше граждан западных государств, лишь подтверждает, что Запад по уши завяз в украинском конфликте и сейчас предпринимает неимоверные усилия для того, чтобы режим Зеленского мог протянуть еще какое-то время. Среди этих усилий, разумеется, и непрекращающиеся поставки киевской хунте западных вооружений. Об этом мы поговорим подробнее на отдельно запрошенном нами заседании 13 сентября. К сожалению, в эти дни не обошлось и без трагедий, которые уже стали отличительным знаком, испытывающей серьезные проблемы системы украинской ПВО. Так, 30 августа в Харькове по причине ошибки в работе украинской ПВО трагически погибли 7 человек, включая ребенка, и получили ранения еще 77 человек, в том числе 18 детей. Промахнувшаяся противоракета должна была самоуничтожиться, но этого не произошло. Были и другие схожие инциденты. Их причина прежняя, и мы на нее неоднократно указывали. Размещение средств украинской ПВО в жилых кварталах украинских городов в нарушение принципов МГП, соблюдать которые в иных случаях столь активно призывают наши западные коллеги. Им, наверное, полезно будет узнать, что ВСУ не только открыто размещают огневые позиции в школах, детских садах и больницах, но и перевозят военных машинами скорой помощи и школьными автобусами. 2 из таких автобусов с надписью «Дети» попали в ДТП на Украине за последние дни, и факт наличия в них военных задокументировали в соцсетях возмущенные украинские пользователи. Господин председатель, нанесенные нами за последние дни удары действительно оказались для киевского режима весьма болезненными. Отсюда и истерика, которую сегодня подхватили наши западные коллеги. Хочу задать им вопрос. А чего вы ждали? Чего вы ожидали, когда контролируемый вами просроченный украинский лидер вместо мирных переговоров, о которых он сам и его подчиненные рассуждали в контактах с посредниками из стран глобального юга, выбрал курскую авантюру и направил мощный, в основном подготовленный на Западе, ударный кулак на мирный приграничный российский регион? Вы не предупреждали его, что за подобными действиями последует справедливое возмездие и неотвратимая расплата? И это только начало, ведь украинские головорезы, вторгшиеся в Курскую область чуть более месяца назад, развязали против мирных жителей самый настоящий террор. Недавно стали известны ужасающие свидетельства расстрела укронацистами 3 детей 10-12 лет в селе Малая Локня. Также в СМИ попали кадры расправы бандеровцев над пожилыми жителями этого населенного пункта, собравшимися на площади для дальнейшей эвакуации. Всего жертвами Малой Локни тогда стало около 10 человек. Украинские боевики похищают не успевших эвакуироваться мирных жителей Курской области. Сейчас составляются списки таких лиц. Есть задокументированные данные и о сексуальном насилии наемников и украинских радикалов в отношении мирных жителей. А попавшие в плен украинские солдаты признавались в том, что командование приказывало им расстреливать гражданских лиц в Курской области, если те оказывают сопротивление. У нас есть видеопоказания, подтверждающие наличие подобных преступных приказов. Все вы, сидящие в этом зале и выдающие последствия работы украинских средств ПВО за целенаправленные российские атаки, ни словом не обмолвились о преступлениях ВСУ на Курской земле. Так же, как не упомянули вы и о многочисленных случаях обстрелов киевским режимом мирных российских городов, произошедших за последние дни. Так, 28 августа в Запорожской области ВСУ применили снаряженный боеприпасом дрон против гражданского автомобиля. В результате 1 ребенок погиб на месте, еще 4 человека получили ранения. Обращу ваше внимание, что оператор дрона прекрасно видит свою цель, что делает такие нападения преднамеренными. 29 августа 5 украинских беспилотников нанесли удары по больнице в Херсонской области. Ранена медсестра. 30 августа они целенаправленно обстреляли Белгород и Белгородский район кассетными боеприпасами из РСЗО чешского производства «Вампир». Погибли 5 мирных жителей, десятки людей ранены, включая несовершеннолетних. Повреждено множество жилых, многоквартирных и частных домов, автомобилей и других гражданских объектов. 1 сентября режим Зеленского предпринял массированную атаку на 15 российских регионов. Дежурными средствами ПВО было перехвачено и уничтожено 158 различных беспилотных летательных аппаратов. 2 сентября киевская хунта нанесла преднамеренный ракетный удар по одному из детских садов Белгорода. Он был полностью разрушен. К счастью, обошлось без пострадавших благодаря заблаговременно принятым местными властями мерам по приостановке работы дошкольных учреждений и школ в небезопасных районах города. Проведение массированных атак по густонаселенным районам именно 1-2 сентября, в самом начале учебного года, когда многие дети пошли в школу, свидетельствует, что именно дети находятся под прицелом киевского режима. 3 сентября украинские беспилотники атаковали храм и социальный объект в селе Грузское на Белгородчине, целенаправленно сбросив на них взрывные устройства. При этом в храме в момент теракта было 10 человек, прихожане и работники. В результате контузии получил настоятель. В тот же день в Донецке обстрелян рынок «Сокол», в результате чего погибли 2 детей 2011 и 2009 года рождения, а также мужчины. Ранены 8 человек, в том числе дети. Всего с февраля 2022 года на территории Белгородской области зарегистрировано почти 16,5 тысяч обстрелов гражданской инфраструктуры, в том числе 9 с лишним тысяч артиллерии и РСЗО, а также 7 с лишним тысяч с применением БПЛА. Это привело к гибели 245 мирных граждан, в том числе 17 детей. Ранения получили 1483 человека, в том числе 112 детей. Повреждено 34 600 гражданских объектов. Только с 1 августа в результате ударов киевского режима по Белгородской области убито 10 местных жителей, ранено 157 человек, из них 14 детей. Повреждены 2 больницы, 13 торговых центров и магазинов, 2 дома культуры, 5 административных зданий, православный храм, 3 предприятия промышленности, 2 газопровода, 4 ЛЭП, автозаправочные станции, 48 многоквартирных домов, а также 140 частных домовладений, 446 автомобилей, 5 единиц сельхозтехники. Вчера киевский режим осуществил массовую атаку по жилым домам и гражданским объектам в нескольких российских областях, в результате чего есть погибшие и раненые. Подчеркнем, что в непосредственной близости от этих объектов не были расположены ни военная инфраструктура, ни военнослужащие. Нас, честно признаться, уже давно не удивляют вопиющие двойные стандарты западных спонсоров киевского режима. Их в таких случаях поражает избирательная слепота, та самая, которую они демонстрировали все 8 лет, пока киевский режим, в том числе и под прикрытием минских договоренностей, обстреливал мирные города Донбасса. Такая же слепота охватывает Соединенные Штаты и их сателлитов, когда киевская хунта проявляет свою нацистскую сущность. Она проступает не только в возвеличивании нацистских приспешников и гитлеровских пособников, на руках которых кровь сотен тысяч невинных евреев, поляков, русских, цыган и украинцев, казненных националистическими украинскими карателями. Она видна невооруженным глазом на кадрах, на которых украинские военные позируют в интернете, даже не пытаясь скрыть многочисленные нацистские символы, флаги и эмблемы. Мужества признать эту постыдную проблему хватает на Западе лишь у единиц. Мужества признать эту постыдную проблему хватает на Западе лишь у единиц. Так, премьер-министр Словакии во время посещения музея Холокоста в одном из словацких городов счел возможным отметить, что, цитирую, «Мы все говорим о фашизме, нацизме и при этом молча терпим тот факт, что по Украине бегают войска, имеющие очень четкое обозначение, связанные с движениями, которые мы сегодня считаем опасными и запрещенными. Международное сообщество должно признать, что нельзя допустить, чтобы на Украине воевали войска, которые используют нацистские обозначения и часто так себя ведут». Конец цитаты. Еще раз повторяю, подобные слова на Западе можно услышать нечасто. Гораздо чаще мы сталкиваемся с попытками либо замолчать нелицеприятные для киевского режима факты, либо даже подыграть украинской пропаганде. Вот, например, позиция Канады, в которой власти активно думают, стоит ли, как планировалось, по настоянию жертв Холокоста придать огласке список из 900 нацистских преступников, сбежавших в эту страну после разгрома фашистской Германии. Среди аргументов против этого шага выдвигается и такой. Разглашение имен может поставить в неловкое положение украинскую общину Канады. Как будто ее в таковое не поставило состоявшееся год назад, в сентябре 2023 года, в Палате общин Канады чествование участника 14-й добровольческой пехотной дивизии СС «Галичина» Ярослава Гунько, в котором принял личное участие глава киевского режима. Неудивительно, что в подобных условиях полного непротивления со стороны Запада нацизм на Украине расцветает махровым цветом. Нацистским преступникам поклоняются все, от солдат до дипломатов. Так, посольство Украины в Японии сообщило на своем аккаунте в соцсети X, что 3 сентября посол Украины в Японии Корсунский посетил храм Ясукуни и оплакал тех, кто отдал жизнь за свою страну. Это, как известно, 14 военных преступников класса А, осужденных Международным военным трибуналом для Дальнего Востока, известным также как Токийский процесс, прах которых покоится в Ясукуне. Именно их, служащий нацистскому режиму украинский дипломат, считает отдавшими жизнь за свою страну. Главные японские СМИ это событие, понятное дело, просто проигнорировали. А японское правительство продолжает, как ни в чем не бывало, покрывать киевский режим и поставлять ему оружие. Хочу в этой связи обратить внимание на то, что эта дата, 3 сентября, была выбрана не случайно. В этот день в России и во многих других странах отмечали 79-ю годовщину победы над милитаристской Японией и окончания Второй мировой войны. Очевидно, что этот демарш представителей Украины продиктован попытками переписать историю. Господин председатель, Россия никогда не смирится с попытками обелить тех, кто совершил военные преступления и преступления против человечности в ряде западных стран. В частности, от японского руководства пока так и не последовало покаяние за агрессию против целого ряда государств, в том числе СССР на Дальнем Востоке, что, к слову, было условием ее принятия в члены ООН. Теперь же Токио и его западные союзники еще и имеют наглость выдвигать невнятные и неуместные обвинения в том, что это якобы СССР ответственен за развязывание Второй мировой войны. В этих условиях нет ничего нелогичного в том, что в последние годы западный лагерь, включая Германию, Японию, Италию, голосует против вносимой нами ежегодной резолюции о недопустимости героизации нацизма и обеления нацистских преступников. Политика Запада в отношении киевского режима четко свидетельствует о том, что борьба с нацизмом и неонацизмом в его планы сегодня не входит. Зато она входит в наши планы, и нацистов и неонацистов на своей земле мы не допустим. Именно эта задача является одной из целей нашей специальной военной операции. Поэтому не сомневайтесь, что украинских нацистов и милитаристов ждет такая же судьба, как их немецких и японских предшественников. Благодарю за внимание.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Mr. President, thank you for convening this meeting at the request of the delegations of Ecuador and France. I thank Acting Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Ms. Joyce Musia, for her briefing. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the escalating security situation and the deteriorating humanitarian situation relating to the conflict in Ukraine. The conflict has been ongoing for 2.5 years with seemingly no end in sight. In recent months, the conflict has escalated drastically and the battlefield has expanded as both Russia and Ukraine have reportedly intensified their offensives. From the Human Rights Monitoring Mission to Ukraine, HRMMU report of 9 August 2024, Sierra Leone notes an alarming increase in civilian casualties since March this year, with July being the deadliest month with at least 209 civilians killed and 1,018 injured. The number of civilian casualties, particularly in Ukraine, for August are similarly alarming, with at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured. Ukraine's emergency service has reported that Russia carried out the deadliest single attack of this year on the east central Ukrainian town of Poltava on Tuesday, 3rd September 2024, with 328 people injured and 55 reported dead from the ongoing rescue operation. The Russian Defense Ministry reported on Wednesday that the precision strike in the central Ukrainian city of Poltava had targeted a Ukrainian Armed Forces center where foreign instructors trained communications, electronic warfare specialists, and drone operators. Sierra Leone takes note of Ukraine's letter of Wednesday, 4th September 2024, reporting of major attacks carried out that same day in the western city of Lviv and the central city of Kryvyi, which also resulted in civilian injuries and deaths, including children. The attacks also reportedly resulted in significant damage to civilian infrastructures, such as schools, educational facilities, medical institutions, stores, and at least 7 local architectural monuments, all buildings located in the city's historic area and UNESCO buffer zone, which aims to protect World Heritage property. Earlier today, Russian officials reported a large-scale Ukrainian drone attack on populated areas in Moscow, resulting in 1 death and damage to housing facilities. The attack resulted in the closure of 3 of Moscow's 4 airports for several hours and diversion of almost 50 flights. Sierra Leone reiterates that attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international law. We call on all sides to ensure compliance with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the immense impact of the conflict on civilians. This is more so the case in Ukraine. According to HRMMU reports, relentless attacks on frontline oblasts and urban centers across Ukraine continue to destroy homes, hospitals, schools, railway infrastructure, and energy facilities. Entire neighborhoods and villages have been destroyed. A major children's hospital in Kiev was recently attacked. It is recorded that 35,160 civilian casualties, including 11,520 deaths, have occurred, and more than 20,000 injured since the conflict began on 24th February 2022. According to OCHA flash updates on 6 September 2024, intensive attacks and shifts in the front line have resulted in the closure of basic public services, forcing millions of people to flee high-risk locations in Donetsk Oblast, separating families and exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Reported attacks against Ukraine's energy infrastructure since March 2024 have drastically reduced the country's electricity capacity, leading to daily power cuts for millions of people across Ukraine. These outages, often lasting many hours, limit access to water, mobile networks and internet, and public transportation, and disrupt children's ability to study, as many in Ukraine attend school remotely. Vulnerable groups, especially older people and persons with disabilities, have been particularly affected by these disruptions in essential services. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned over this development as Ukraine approaches its 3rd winter since the start of the conflict in February 2022. We note that to address the winter-specific needs, the humanitarian community launched the 2024-2025 Winter Response Plan, appealing for $492.1 million to support 1.8 million people with critical winter-related humanitarian assistance, as outlined in the 2024 Humanitarian Needs and Response Plan. This plan intends to support timely preparedness and response. Only 28% of the 2024 humanitarian appeal have been received as of the end of June, a significant funding shortfall. Sierra Leone calls upon the international community to support this plan to address the pressing needs of the people, enhance living conditions, and ensure access to essential services. Mr. President, the attacks on nuclear energy infrastructure over the past 2 months pose serious security threats not only for Ukraine and Russia, but for the entire region. We note comments by IAEA Chief Grossi on his recent trip to the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, warning against further attacks on the plant, which could further destabilize it, resulting in a nuclear disaster. We urge both parties to the conflict to refrain from launching attacks on nuclear power plants in both Ukraine and Russia. The alarming civilian casualty figures and humanitarian crisis in Ukraine underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians and refrain from further escalation and pursuit of the option of winning the war on the battlefield at all costs. Dialogue and diplomacy should be the primary tools employed to de-escalate tensions and pave the way for a peaceful resolution of the conflict. The international community, including this Council, must remain steadfast in its commitment to supporting the pursuit of a just and sustainable peace. Sierra Leone once more calls for good faith diplomatic efforts in pursuit of a peaceful resolution involving the parties to the conflict. Meaningful steps must be taken towards the immediate de-escalation and cessation of the hostilities. We urge parties to the conflict to engage constructively, including on their legitimate concerns, to find a political and diplomatic solution as envisaged in Article 33 of the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Mozambique.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank the Acting Under-Secretary General, Joyce Msuya, for her briefing. I also welcome the representative of Ukraine in today's meeting. Mr. President, we remain profoundly concerned with the prevailing situation in Ukraine as the security situation continues to deteriorate at an alarming scale. The consequences of this conflict have reached unprecedented levels of catastrophic severity, inflicting immeasurable human suffering. Regrettably, civilians continue to pay the ultimate and highest price arising from this conflict. We witness with great distress the ongoing loss of lives, injuries, human rights violations, massive forced displacement, refugees, and destruction of critical civilian infrastructure, including homes, schools, hospitals, water, gas, and power systems. As this conflict persists without signs of abatement and with prospect for a mutually acceptable solution remaining elusive, we sadly anticipate a further deterioration of the already dire security and humanitarian situation. According to the UNDP, the level of destruction in Ukraine represents the loss of 18 years of socio-economic development progress. The estimated cost of reconstruction and recovery exceeds $448 billion over the next decade. Mr. President, while acknowledging that there is no humanitarian solution for this man-made crisis, our position on the humanitarian dimension of these and other conflicts is consistent and remains unchanged. We reiterate once again our four main points. Firstly, the protection of civilians is the cornerstone of the international humanitarian law. We therefore call on all parties to ensure their safety and fulfill their obligations in this regard. Secondly, the principles of distinction, precaution, and proportionality must be scrupulously adhered and upheld by all parties at all times. Thirdly, all parties must facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unhindered access for humanitarian personnel and relief to civilians in need. Lastly, ending this conflict is the only way to address its severe humanitarian consequences. In light of these considerations, we reiterate our call for an urgent and immediate cessation of hostilities and a return to direct negotiations without any preconditions. Such negotiations should consider the legitimate security concerns of all involved parties with the aim of ensuring a peaceful, sustainable, and lasting solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Acting Under-Secretary General Joyce Msuya for the update provided and welcome the participation of the representative of Ukraine. We note with alarm the recent escalation in hostilities since the Council's last briefing on Ukraine. The past 2 weeks in particular have seen harrowing reports of multiple civilian casualties across several regions in Ukraine. These continued attacks against critical civilian infrastructure, including energy infrastructure, represent a persistent pattern of violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. According to OHCHR, August recorded the second highest number of civilian casualties for the year, no doubt exacerbated by the large-scale coordinated attacks that struck Ukraine during the week of 26th of August. Attacks that not only resulted in the killing of 8 civilians, but also caused widespread damage to energy facilities in 15 regions. We also note the reports of civilian casualties sustained in the Kursk region of the Russian Federation, and the notable increase in attacks on schools and hospitals in Ukraine. Mr. President, innocent civilians must not continue to pay the ultimate price in this war. Guyana reiterates its demand for an immediate end to the indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and calls for full adherence to international humanitarian law. We also reiterate that every member state of the United Nations has an obligation to uphold the UN Charter and the wider body of international law. We further call upon the parties to the conflict to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects from harm and to take all necessary measures to minimize the risk of civilian injury, death, and damage to civilian infrastructure. Mr. President, colleagues, this Council continues to meet month after month to discuss the armed conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Yet each month we leave these chambers without making any meaningful progress that would stop the bloodshed and bring relief to civilians. Today, the death toll has reached almost 12,000 and is expected to climb even higher in the months to come. It is worth reminding that this Council has the responsibility to maintain international peace and security. It is simply not enough to acknowledge the horrors of this war, including the rising death toll. This Council must do more to stop the carnage and avoid normalizing the suffering of innocent civilians. Civilians are not collateral damage. As we have done before, Guyana demands an immediate end to the hostilities and urges the parties to commit to a serious political and diplomatic process toward ending the conflict and to engage in good faith. Mr. President, this war will leave behind a legacy of destruction and prolonged economic and social challenges. The psychological trauma and residual effects will also be acutely felt for generations to come. This is why it must end. Guyana therefore reiterates its call for the Russian Federation to immediately withdraw its military forces from the international recognized territory of Ukraine and find a peaceful end to this conflict. We further call upon the Russian Federation to allow unfettered humanitarian access to the people in need of humanitarian assistance in the occupied territories and to sign an action plan with the United Nations to end and prevent grave violations against children. The international community must also scale up support for the humanitarian needs and response plan and the winter response plan. In closing, Mr. President, I once again reiterate Guyana's support toward all efforts aimed at ending this war and achieving sustainable peace for the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank Acting USG Masuya for her comprehensive briefing. As we discussed last week, the massive and widespread missile barrage on Ukraine continue unabated. The United Nations has also reported a high number of civilian casualties. We are appalled by the scale of devastation, and we strongly condemn these attacks. Our deepest condolences and sympathies are extended to the families and friends of those who were victimized in Ukraine. We also keep in our thoughts those who were injured and wish them a speedy recovery. Let us emphasize this once again. There must be no impunity for war crimes and other atrocities, including attacks against civilians and critical civilian infrastructure. Those responsible for these heinous acts must be held accountable. Mr. President, Russia, a permanent member of the Security Council, which should be a guardian of the international order based on the rule of law, is openly breaking international law through aggression against another sovereign country in an attempt to change the status quo by force. Russia is also blatantly violating Security Council resolutions by procuring ballistic missiles from North Korea to use against Ukraine. These conducts and the facts are truly serious challenges to the global peace and security system. Such disgraceful attempts must fail. Otherwise, it could signal the collapse of the international order and the replacement of the rule of law with rule by force, where might makes right. Most of our colleagues here and the overwhelming majority of the international community will never accept such a world. We remain committed to the principled position we have upheld consistently, which is grounded in the UN Charter. Let us be clear, the purposes and principles of the Charter are non-negotiable. Peace in Ukraine must be achieved in accordance with the Charter. Today, the representative of Russian Federation maliciously make remarks on Japan. Their remarks are totally unacceptable and do not reflect the facts and achievements that Japan has been making for the past almost 80 years. Since the end of World War II, Japan has consistently followed the path of a peace-loving nation, actively contributing to peace, stability, and prosperity in the region and beyond. It is the Russian Federation that disturbs the international order based on the rule of law and the UN Charter is seeking. Mr. President, since the beginning of the aggression, Japan has provided Ukraine more than $12 billion, including humanitarian recovery and reconstruction assistance. Japan will continue to steadfastly and seamlessly support Ukraine's economic resilience and development, from emergency assistance and daily livelihood reconstruction to more advanced stages of industrial rebuilding. In conclusion, Mr. President, as a member of the Security Council, bearing a responsibility for international peace and security, as a country that stands by its principled position and a nation of peace, we continue to demand Russia's immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal from Ukraine. Our firm support for Ukraine is unwavering. Japan continues to stand with the people of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Japan for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Monsieur le Président, je remercie la secrétaire générale adjointe aux affaires humanitaires ad interim, Madame Joyce Msuya, pour son intervention. Une fois de plus, ce Conseil se réunit suite aux intenses attaques russes menées à travers l'Ukraine. Ces derniers jours, de l'ouest à l'est du pays, des villes ont été la cible de vagues d'attaques, dont certaines figurent parmi les plus meurtrières depuis le début de l'agression militaire de la Russie. Les habitantes et habitants de Lviv, de Kryvyi, de Kharkiv, de Poltava, de Kiev et des régions de Soumy et de Donetsk, entre autres, continuent de payer le prix de cette violence. La Suisse condamne ces attaques qui touchent la population et les infrastructures civiles. Nous sommes choqués par le nombre des victimes, dont de nombreux enfants, et par les dégâts considérables causés aux habitations, aux établissements de santé et d'enseignement, perturbant une fois de plus l'éducation au début de la nouvelle année scolaire. Nos pensées vont aux victimes et à leurs proches. Nous sommes particulièrement consternés par les attaques contre des zones où des personnes ayant fui les lignes de front, qui ont cherché refuge avant de voir leur vie basculer une fois de plus. Monsieur le Président, il importe de le répéter, une guerre d'agression ne peut jamais être justifiée. De plus, les guerres ont des limites clairement établies par le droit international humanitaire que toutes les parties au conflit doivent respecter en toutes circonstances. Elles doivent notamment en tout temps respecter le principe de distinction entre les civils et les combattants, ainsi qu'entre les biens civils et les biens militaires. Diriger les attaques contre la population civile et les biens de caractère civil constitue un crime de guerre. En outre, dans la conduite des hostilités, toutes les précautions pratiquement possibles doivent être prises pour éviter les pertes en vie civile et les dommages qui pourraient être causés aux biens civils. Des enquêtes approfondies et indépendantes doivent être menées sur ces attaques graves et les responsables doivent répondre de leurs actes. Monsieur le Président, le travail des partenaires humanitaires en Ukraine est inestimable. Au cours des 6 premiers mois de cette année, les organisations d'aide ont apporté une assistance à 5,6 millions de personnes. Les civils dépendent chaque jour de ce soutien vital. La Suisse salue les efforts inlassables du personnel humanitaire, qu'il s'agit de fournir une aide immédiate aux côtés des premiers intervenants après les attaques ou d'assister ceux qui sont contraints de fuir les zones près des lignes de front. Ils accomplissent ces actions au péril de leur propre sécurité. Le droit international humanitaire exige que toutes les personnes autorisent et facilitent l'accès humanitaire aux civils dans le besoin. La situation humanitaire risque de se détériorer davantage avec l'arrivée prochaine de la saison froide, notamment en raison des importants dommages causés aux infrastructures. Il y a 2 semaines, une attaque à grande échelle des forces russes contre les infrastructures énergétiques ukrainiennes, la 9e en 5 mois, a de nouveau causé des dégâts considérables. Nous restons préoccupés par l'impact de la dégradation du système énergétique sur les centrales nucléaires ukrainiennes. Nous saluons donc les efforts continus de l'IAEA pour assurer la sûreté et la sécurité nucléaire dans la région. La Suisse continuera de fournir de l'aide humanitaire. Nous soutenons le Fonds humanitaire de l'ONU pour l'Ukraine et apportons un soutien matériel dans le domaine de l'énergie en vue de l'hiver. En ces moments critiques, un soutien international coordonné est indispensable. Il est crucial d'agir rapidement et de manière coordonnée pour réduire l'impact des mines et autres engins explosifs sur les populations. C'est dans cet esprit que la Suisse, en collaboration avec l'Ukraine, organise le Ukraine Mine Action Conference le 17 et 18 octobre à Lausanne. Nous comptons sur une participation de haut niveau de la part de tous les pays engagés dans cet effort. Cependant, pour parvenir à une amélioration durable, cette guerre doit cesser. Nous appelons la Russie à retirer ses troupes du territoire ukrainien. Nous restons déterminés à contribuer à une paix juste et durable en Ukraine, conformément à la Charte des Nations Unies. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. I would like to thank Ms. Masuya for her briefing. After the last time the Council met on this topic, when the Okhmadit Children's Hospital was hit in early July, killing and destruction across Ukraine has been intensifying. Since then, more than 1,700 long-range weapons systems, including missiles and drone strikes, have hit homes, schools, and hospitals. According to WHO, more than a third of global attacks against healthcare facilities during the months of June and July occurred in Ukraine. As we have heard in one of the previous briefings, July has been the deadliest month for civilians in almost 2 years. Sadly, the escalation continued, as it became clear with the August 26 strike when Russia launched what seems to have been the largest air assault since the war began. More than 200 drones and missiles were launched to hit targets across Ukraine. Unabated, these attacks have continued throughout last week, killing dozens of people and injuring hundreds, damaging and destroying civilian infrastructure in multiple cities throughout Ukraine, from Lviv to Poltava, from Sumy to Zaporizhia. Moreover, The UN has repeatedly documented Russia's double-tap strike tactics against civilians and first responders, which is a grave violation of international humanitarian law and may constitute a war crime. As we heard from Ms. Masuya, when it comes to critical civilian infrastructure, the energy infrastructure ends up in the crosshairs of Russian missiles particularly often. Reportedly, Russia destroyed 80% of Ukraine's thermal energy generation and a third of its hydro generation capacity. Just in June, 33 attacks on energy infrastructure were registered. Let me be clear, this is not legitimate military targets, and these attacks clearly run counter to the provisions of international humanitarian law. The only goal here is to oppress the civilian population and make their lives harder during the approaching winter months. There were no exceptions to this tactic in the last few weeks, when mainly electricity distribution infrastructure was targeted. This had far-reaching consequences for nuclear safety and security, as the widespread strikes caused major fluctuations in the power supply and led to the temporary shutdown or disconnection of reactor units in 2 Ukrainian nuclear power plants. Colleagues, the nuclear safety and security situation in the region is perilous, and we need to ensure full respect of the 7 indispensable pillars for nuclear safety and security and the 5 basic principles for the protection of Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant. A nuclear accident in the midst of war would be devastating for the whole region and would have global impacts. The Council must engage in order to address and prevent this from happening. I resume my function as President of the Council. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
主席，我要对美国代表刚才的发言做出简短回应。中方在乌克兰问题上的立场非常明确，那就是劝和促谈，政治解决。我们是这么说的，也是这么做的。中国迄今所做的努力，目的只有一个，就是和平。我们的外交努力并不支持谁，也不偏向谁。我们遵循的是联合国宪章的宗旨和原则，我们尊重的是各国的主权和领土完整。我们希望美方能够为推动早日停火止战做出切实努力，而不是不停地吹嘘自己向战场投入了多少武器，更不是对中国以及其他国家的真诚努力进行攻击和抹黑。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, acting under Secretary General Msuya. I also recognize the continuing occupation of the seat of the Soviet Union by the dictator's envoy, or rather the presence of a lonely young Russian diplomat abandoned by her cowardly adult male colleagues. The whining of the Russian envoy about a defense operation on Russian territory is a striking contrast to Putin's radio silence and the Russian Ministry of Defense denial of events on Russian territory. It is not for the first time that the Russian envoy is out of tune with his masters. Let's recall the night of the full-scale invasion in this chamber. We have addressed the Security Council with a request to convene this meeting due to the recent spike of missile terror by Russia against Ukrainian people and critical infrastructure. This escalation is causing widespread suffering and devastation and must be addressed before it leads to an even larger humanitarian catastrophe. It speaks volumes that we are meeting in this chamber simultaneously with participating in the opening of the 79th session of the UN General Assembly, taking place right now. This will be the fourth session during the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and it opens not with the fanfare that usually accompanies the beginning of a new General Assembly annual cycle, but with the explosions of ballistic missiles and the cries of wounded Ukrainian civilians. Indeed, if Russia had not started this war, we could have been sitting in the General Assembly hall, sharing positive expectations for the forthcoming 80th anniversary of our organization. Instead, we hear the Secretary General's acknowledgement that today's global order simply does not work for anyone. Instead, we hear the former PGA admitting that we do not have the capacity, nor do we have the mission to force Russians to respect international law. Meanwhile, on the eve of the Summit of the Future, we are debating whether we can even use the word aggression in its final document. And all this time, Russia continues to openly wipe their feet on the UN Charter and to kill Ukrainians. This is what we have today, and if it does not change, it will shape our future, a future that will differ drastically from the vision to be enshrined in the Pact for the Future. The series of recent tragedies in Ukraine occurring almost daily indicates that the war of annihilation against my country continues, fueled by blind hatred and a criminal instinct to kill and destroy. The UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine reported at least 184 civilians killed and 856 injured in Ukraine in August, the second highest monthly number of civilian casualties in 2024, immediately after July. This means that Russia is intent on maintaining a dangerously high level of threat to civilians, considering them a priority target. Over the past 2 weeks, the Russian attacks have resulted in a significant number of casualties and much destruction. On August 30th, Russia used guided aerial bombs to strike a residential building along with a nearby playground, as well as an educational facility in the city of Kharkov, killing at least 7 people, including a child, and injuring 77 others, including 18 children. On September the 1st, the Russian missile attack on a center for social and psychological rehabilitation of children and an orphanage in Sumy injured at least 18 civilians, including 6 children. On the same day, Russia launched 8 ballistic missiles targeting residential buildings, the main indoor sports arena, a shopping center, and a recreation area in Kharkiv. The series of strikes injured at least 44 people, including 7 children. The next day, September the 2nd, a barrage of 35 Russian missiles and 23 UAVs targeted the Kyiv, Sumy, and Kharkiv regions. In Kyiv, for instance, Russian missiles damaged the Islamic Cultural Center, including a mosque and a prayer hall. On September the 3rd, 2 Russian ballistic missiles hit an educational institution and a nearby hospital in Poltava, killing 58 and injuring 325 people. There were casualties from Russian attacks in Zaporizhia and Dnipro that day. An 8-year-old boy was among those killed in Zaporizhia, where a Russian missile struck a hotel complex. In Sumy, Russia attacked the building of the university with a guided aerial missile. On September the 4th, 2024, Russia brought enormous pain and suffering to Lviv. The images of Yaroslav Bazilevich, the injured local resident who, in a single moment, lost his wife and 3 daughters after a Russian missile hit the house, have become yet another symbol of the cruelty of Russia's war, as well as a reminder that Russia's war crimes must not go unpunished. Yaroslav's daughters were not the only children killed that day in Lviv, as Russian missiles also took the life of an infant. The scale of destruction was also high, as in total 156 buildings in Lviv were damaged, including 3 schools and 2 medical institutions. 74 people were injured, many of them seriously, following the shelling of Pavlograd, Dnipro region, that occurred on September the 6th. The next day, civilians were killed in Nikopol, Dnipropetrovsk region. Russia continues to use DPRK ballistic missiles in its attacks against Ukrainian people and our civilian infrastructure. We are also deeply concerned over the reports on the possible transfer of ballistic missiles by Iran to the Russian Federation. The deepening of military technical cooperation between Russia and Iran poses serious security threats not only for Ukraine, but for the whole of Europe, the Middle East, and the world. We call on the international community to increase pressure on Tehran and Moscow in order to protect international peace and security. Mr. President, it is quite evident that the killing of civilians and strikes on critical infrastructure are key elements of Russia's war strategy. Such deliberate cruelty is aimed, among other things, at intimidation not only of Ukraine, but mostly of our partners, in order to prevent decisions that would allow Ukraine to carry out long-range strikes on Russian territory. This is the logic of a gangster, which is essentially what Putin is. One should beat a victim with such cruelty that passersby do not even try to defend them, but rather cross to the other side of the street from fear that the same may happen to them. However, the world is not a criminal neighborhood in Leningrad, where Putin grew up, and the international community is not a group of intimidated passersby afraid of a street altercation. Putin has already shed so much blood that Russia's attempts to intimidate the world with red lines simply do not work. It is clear that peaceful civilians in Ukraine will be protected much better if we shift our aim from the missiles over our heads in their launch sites and places of storage. Mr. President, there are similar motives guiding the Russian military command to give orders to execute Ukrainian prisoners of war. We have regularly drawn attention to this war crime committed by the Russian army. All indications suggest that we are dealing not with isolated incidents at a low level, but with a practice sanctioned by the higher command and endorsed by the political leadership. This is evidenced by the mass nature of such crimes, the demonstrative way in which they are committed, the extensive video documentation accompanied by a real PR campaign and glorification of such acts in the Russian segment of social media, as well as the absence of any, even formal, reaction by Russian law enforcement. The Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine has been investigating at least 28 incidents of summary executions of 73 Ukrainian prisoners of war by the Russian military. Since November 2023, the number of Ukrainian soldiers who have been captured and then executed by the Russians has increased. Most of such incidents are recorded in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. One of the most recent investigations was launched after footage emerged from near the city of Pokrovsk in Donbass, filmed from a drone in late August. The footage shows Russian troops executing 3 surrendering Ukrainian soldiers after their trench was overrun. Other footage, which emerged on Russian social media last week, shows the alleged execution-style killing of a captured and unarmed Ukrainian serviceman by a Russian military. The killer commented on his crime with the propaganda narrative about, quote-unquote, our land that we have come to liberate from Nazism. These bogus justifications for killing Ukrainians on Ukrainian soil should be borne in mind by the UN member states every time Russia attempts to monopolize and misuse the common victory over Nazism in the Second World War, here in the UN platform, while whitewashing its current crimes. We reiterate that if prisoners of war surrender, visibly indicating their intent, and are unarmed, any summary execution is unequivocally a war crime. The alleged executions constitute war crimes and are seen as part of a broader, orchestrated policy by the Kremlin. War crimes shall not be subject to any statute of limitations, and Ukraine will persist in seeking justice until all perpetrators are held accountable. We also reiterate our call for the Security Council to address the appalling practices of execution, ill treatment, and torture of Ukrainian POWs by Russia. Mr. President, on September the 8th, Russia again resorted to a ritual action which they call elections, exploiting some procedural resemblance to genuine political process in democratic countries. Once again, Russia tried to extend this process to the temporarily occupied territory of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea and the city of Sevastopol, Ukraine. The so-called elections in the Russian Federation long ago turned into a farce that has nothing to do with the manifestation of people's power and holding them in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine in violation of norms and principles of international law actually delegitimizes Russia's political system. Russian elections in the occupied territories are not only aimed at legitimizing the occupying administration, but also serve as an instrument of intimidation used to test the loyalty of local residents. Reluctance to participate in this farce may lead to suspicions of disloyalty, accusations of collaboration with Ukraine, and subsequent persecution. In this regard, we reiterate that results of the so-called elections on the temporarily occupied territory of Autonomous Republic of Ukraine and the city of Sevastopol are null and void, and the elections themselves are illegitimate. We emphasize that all those involved in the preparation and holding of the so-called elections in the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine will be held accountable in accordance with the Ukrainian law. Mr. President, Ukraine does want to end this war because more than anything, Ukraine wants peace. But Ukraine also wants to save its people as well as its statehood. It is the Russian dictator who does not want peace and is obsessed with territorial conquests. He wants Ukrainian cities, or rather their ruins, as a symbol of his victory. And that is why Ukraine needs the strength and the ability to destroy the Russian means of killing and destruction that are situated far from the Ukrainian cities that are their targets. That is why, where they are stationed, and at a time when they pose a threat only to those who use them and not to peaceful Ukrainians. We need to force Russia to seek peace, a comprehensive, just and lasting peace in line with the principles of the UN Charter as envisaged by both UNGA resolutions 11/6 and the Ukrainian peace formula. This is the only path to justice, the Ukrainian peace formula, respect for the norms of international law, the restoration of Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement, and now I give the floor to the representative of Lithuania.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to address the Council on behalf of the three Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and my own country, Lithuania. We also align ourselves with the statement of the European Union. We congratulate Slovenia on assuming presidency of the Security Council this month and express appreciation for holding this meeting to consider recent attacks on civilians in Ukraine perpetrated by Russia in its ongoing war of aggression against Ukraine. We also thank Ms. Joyce Misuya, Acting Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, for her briefing. We commend the work of UN in Ukraine in providing needed humanitarian assistance under increasingly difficult conditions due to the Russia's war of aggression that is also targeting humanitarian organizations in Ukraine. Particularly welcome strong condemnation of recent Russia's attacks issued by UN humanitarian coordinator in Ukraine and immediate actions taken aiming to provide first aid, psychological support, food, repair materials and finances. On our part, Baltic states continue to boost our contributions to the OCHA and its managed funds in Ukraine to support its important work. Mr. President, Since Council's last meeting on this issue, Russia's rockets and bombs continued targeting educational institutions, hospitals, and residential areas in Ukraine. These attacks targeted critical energy infrastructure and residential buildings across 15 Ukrainian regions, including the capital, Kiev. The appalling civilian toll from Russia's strikes on residential areas in Kharkiv on the 30th August, which claimed at least 6 lives, including that of the child, and left more than 80 others wounded, is emblematic of Russia's desperation and complete disregard for human life and international humanitarian law. The latest cruel airstrikes against Poltava and Lviv resulted in killing more than 50 people and wounding more than 200 others, including 3 children and their mother. Due to the constant Russian attacks against Ukraine's critical energy infrastructure, more than 80% of Ukraine's thermal energy generation and a third of its hydro generation has been destroyed. As the cold season is approaching, we must continue humanitarian and financial support to Ukraine with a special focus on the energy sector. The Baltic states reiterated their strong condemnation of ever-growing outrage at continuing Russia's war crimes and violations of international humanitarian law committed as part of Russia's illegal and unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. We call on the international community to unequivocally condemn the aggressive Russian nationalism fomented by the Putin's regime and continuing Russia's imperialist ambitions, which are well known to all the peoples in its neighborhood, not excluding our own nations. We also call on Belarus, Iran, and the DPRK to stop the military supply and assistance to the criminal Russian regime. We are alarmed by the reports of Iranian ballistic missiles transfers to Russia and news from Latvia, where Russian military Shahid-type unmanned aerial vehicle crashed on Saturday after entering the Latvian airspace from Belarus. Aerial vehicle illegally violated Latvia's airspace while carrying explosives. These actions are a prime example of Russia's double standards. Russia keeps conveying the UN Security Council to criticize weapons transfers to Ukraine while violating UN Security Council resolutions and importing different types of weapons from Iran and the DPRK to prolong its aggression against Ukraine, a sovereign state defending its territory. Mr. President, Russia's highest authorities and their accomplices must be held accountable for the crimes of aggression through the establishment of a special tribunal that is based on international law and enjoys the broadest cross-regional support. All countries should insist on implementing the ICJ's binding order to halt the military offensive by Russia against Ukraine and undertake steps to enforce ICC's arrest warrants issued to Russia's top political and military leadership. A failure to arrest an accused criminal that is wanted by the ICC enables impunity and undermines the international criminal law system. The Baltic states reiterate their unwavering support to Ukraine's exercise of its inherent right for self-defense and our solidarity with Ukraine, seeking to restore its territorial integrity and sovereignty within its internationally recognized borders. We will do everything possible to further strengthen our support to Ukraine until its victory. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Lithuania for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, the head of a delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Albania, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the EFTA country Liechtenstein, member of the European Economic Area, as well as Monaco and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Colleagues, I would like to thank Acting USG Joyce Msuya from OCHA for yet another sobering briefing, which again confronts us only weeks after our last meeting with the enormous continuing and even intensifying civilian cost of Russia's war of aggression. The European Union commends the courage and professionalism of all humanitarian workers risking their lives to alleviate human suffering. During the past 2 weeks, this Council has witnessed a series of additional massive Russian drone and missile attacks against cities throughout Ukraine, as we've heard throughout this meeting from other speakers. From Lviv to Poltava, from Kramatorsk to Kiev, in open disregard of the repeated calls
of this Council's members for such illegal attacks to stop. On 26 August, Russia launched an unprecedented number of 236 missiles and drones. On 3 September, at least 55 people were killed and 328 injured in Poltava alone. Now, we repeat our call on Russia to immediately halt its illegal war of aggression, including its unrelenting airstrikes against Ukrainian civilians and civilian and critical infrastructure. It has hit residential buildings, hospitals, schools, power plants, playgrounds. This is unacceptable under any circumstances. Ukraine has lost up to 80% of its pre-war thermal electricity production capacity. It is clear Russia is attempting to pile the pressure on the Ukrainian people ahead of a cold winter. It underlines the need for Ukraine to be able to exercise its legitimate right to self-defense under the UN Charter, to restore its territorial integrity and protect its existence as an independent and sovereign country. Now, we are very concerned by the recent reports indicating that Iran has supplied Russia with ballistic missiles. If confirmed, this delivery would represent a substantive material escalation in Iran's support for Russia's illegal war of aggression. The EU will remain vigilant and, if necessary, will respond swiftly and in coordination with international partners. We call upon all countries, including the DPRK and Belarus, to refrain from any actions that may amount to complicity in Russia's aggression against Ukraine. President, as we have frequently heard from UN briefers in this chamber, Russia has cut off an estimated 1.5 million Ukrainians from humanitarian aid. While Russia wages a war of aggression, it shows no concern for the welfare of civilians in the areas it temporarily occupies. Russia has an obligation to facilitate full, safe, rapid, and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. It should also immediately cease torture, sexual violence, arbitrary detentions of civilians, as reported by the United Nations. In this context, the European Union is supporting Ukraine with emergency and recovery assistance in a wide variety of sectors such as energy, health, shelter, water, sanitation, and hygiene, to alleviate the consequences of Russian strikes on civilians, and of course we will continue to do so. Distinguished members of this Council, in our previous meeting, the Russian representative openly advertised, I underline the word, he advertised his country's intentions to capture, or in his words, liberate, Ukrainian villages and to alter their names and status as part of Russia's attempted annexation of Ukrainian territories. Our credibility requires that such blatant violations of the UN Charter and their celebrations in this room face an immediate answer in this chamber. All states have an obligation under international law to not recognize annexations, let alone to not commit them and then celebrate them. This includes not recognizing the results of Russia's so-called elections in Crimea conducted last weekend. Russia and its leadership must be held fully accountable for waging a war of aggression and for other most serious crimes under international law, as well as for the massive damage caused by its war. We recall that 6 arrest warrants are issued by the International Criminal Court, including against the Russian president, for the war crime of unlawful deportation and transfer of Ukrainian children. All state parties to the Rome Statute are under the obligation to execute that arrest warrant. Colleagues, in closing, later this month, our leaders will gather in New York to recommit to the rule-based multilateral order which the United Nations represents. The Summit of the Future and the many other gatherings during High-Level Week offer a unique opportunity to remobilize international support towards a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine. Many proposals have been floated in this regard, including by members of this Council. What is undeniable, however, is that any peace must be based on the UN Charter and international law, as clearly laid out by the UN General Assembly as well. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sweden.
Thank you very much, President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the 5 Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and my own country, Sweden. We thank OCHA for its briefing and for shedding light on yet another horrendous wave of Russian attacks on civilians and civilian objects in Ukraine, including residential buildings, hospital, water treatment plants, places of worship, schools, and playgrounds. President, in its war of aggression, Russia has chosen terror to achieve its political goal, the subjugation of Ukraine and the annexation of sovereign Ukrainian territory. This blatant disregard of international law and human lives require the strongest of condemnations. It requires that those responsible are held account and that the international community remains firm in its support for a just and sustainable peace, in line with international law, the UN Charter, and relevant IAEA resolutions. President, for years in this very chamber, we have heard Russia's attempt to justify its aggression. We've heard that Ukraine, NATO, and the West in general were poised to launch an attack on Russia. We've heard Russian stories about killer mosquitoes, secret nuclear programs, and biolabs in Ukraine. In reality, all these Russian claims were made to sow confusion and hide the simple truth that Ukrainian people had chosen something that Kremlin feared more than anything else: democracy, liberty, and justice. For Kremlin, the uncomfortable truth is that there is no Russophobic conspiracy. What there is an overwhelming global majority of UN member states that seek to uphold international law and the UN Charter. A majority that seeks to project the inviolability of sovereignty and territorial integrity. A majority that refuses to accept spheres of influence and that might makes right. President, to our Ukrainian friends and to the rest of the world, we have but one message. We will stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes. President Zelensky's 10-point peace plan is a sustainable path towards peace, and it should continue to enjoy global support. To Russia, we say this: leave Ukraine, choose a future where the great potential of the Russian people is used to advance mankind, not bomb its neighbors. Until a comprehensive, just and sustainable peace has been reached in line with international law and the UN Charter, we demand that Russia ensures safe, timely and unimpeded humanitarian access to the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. We demand that you allow UN inspections to verify your unsubstantiated claims of civilian casualties. And we demand that you allow the UN and the ICRC to visit Ukrainian prisoners of war. International humanitarian law requires it. I thank you very much.
I thank the representative of Sweden for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, while aligning with the statement delivered earlier by the European Union, I wish to add a few remarks in my national capacity. Allow me to start by thanking Acting USG Ocha Msuya for her briefing on the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, stemming from the Russian aggression and directly affecting my country, Poland. We host one of the largest communities of Ukrainian refugees, currently reaching almost 1 million people. Poland will continue to provide humanitarian assistance for those in need and support Ukraine's recovery, reconstruction, and modernization, which will be aligned with Kyiv's European perspective. All necessary actions should be taken to avoid a scenario of a protracted humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. The approaching winter remains a major concern given the threats posed to the energy sector. Russia's deliberate targeting of civilians and civilian facilities, such as water, gas, and power systems, has been relentless. The widespread devastation has deprived people of essential services across the country. Just a few days ago, a missile strike in the city of Poltava proved to be the deadliest single attack of this year. Poland once again condemns in the strongest possible terms Russia's continued violations of international law, including human rights law and international humanitarian law. we remain committed to spread use of torture and ill treatment, sexual and gender-based violence, deportation and forced transfer of Ukrainian children, as well as arbitrary deprivation of liberty of Ukrainian citizens. Russia's war, supported by Belarus, constitutes a grave violation of both the UN and OSCE commitments and principles. Mr. President, we are of the view that the Ukrainian peace formula is the only viable peace proposal on the table. It is up to Ukraine, and it should be up to Ukraine, a victim of an unprovoked and unlawful aggression, to set the conditions for peace talks in accordance with the UN Charter. Russia must stop trying to shift the blame on others. The ongoing war is Moscow's exclusive responsibility, nobody else's. Let me repeat, it is Moscow's exclusive responsibility, nobody else's. It is our duty to Ukraine and its people, as well as to the UN Charter, to support those whose rights are being brutally and continuously violated. Poland, for its part, stands in solidarity with victims of the aggression and will not cease to call on Russia to end the senseless killing and destruction of its neighbor. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.